All the way back in 2020, when the modern iteration of AI technology, the large language models, was still in its infancy, the American writer Brian Christian wrote a book, part analysis, part manifesto, called The Alignment Problem. In that book, Christian pointed out the inherent difficulty with asking AI to reflect human values. Because, well, what are human values? How do you formalize ideas like fairness and justice, for example? I may have my own idea of what's fair and just, you may have another, and the coders working on a large language model might have another still. There's actually a particular environment in which this alignment problem is playing out in real time. In the workplace, and more specifically, in the hiring and firing of people doing the work. There are a number of practices, hiring, assessment, trying to minimize the impact of human bias, in which an automated AI-driven system should provide plenty of advantages. That was what Hilke Schellmann was thinking when she set out to write her book, The Algorithm. AI, she thought, could be a solution. As an example, imagine if you could take the human bias out of the hiring process. If the individual person was no longer swayed by the background of the person sitting in front of them, their language, their ethnicity, their education. Wouldn't that be a good thing? I asked Hilke onto the podcast to consider the alignment problem and the gap between what we might expect from AI and what it actually delivers, the gap between intention and implementation, in this area that she has studied in such detail. And the conversation got me thinking about the wider issues around the alignment problem, about how this is maybe not just a problem with an emerging technology, but with our society. I'll share those thoughts later. But first, I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and you're listening to The Lead. Here's my conversation with Hilke. Hilke Schellmann, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Let's first of all put on our rose-tinted glasses. We'll kind of go back to 5 years ago when you first started writing the book and look at the promise of AI and what we imagine it might be able to do and what it might be able to do better than a human. I think it's fair to say that at the beginning, before you went down this rabbit hole of research, you thought, actually, there is a promise of AI in the hiring process that might make the process better.
Yes. And I think the AI vendors sort of use that promise as well, right? Like we know that humans have unconscious bias, right? Like I would say that, we see women, people with disabilities, people of color underrepresented in the workforce. And I would hypothesize that's largely because of unconscious bias, right? Like we have these biases that we see people and we never imagine that they could be a chief of surgery or something like that, right? So this unconscious bias is playing out in the workplace, playing out in hiring and performance reviews, right? We know from social science that people with, non-white sounding names get fewer callbacks from recruiters. We know that folks who are from marginalized groups get worse performance reviews, even though they do the same job and they're as successful as white folks. So we know there is unconscious bias in everything. And in fact, it's really, really hard to get that out of people. So when sort of AI vendors and AI tools came into the workplace, years ago, like the promise was really positive, right? Like it would like test everyone the same way.
Same
and it would look at everyone. Same questions. And it would look at everyone the same way. And it also would look actually at everyone, right? I think that one of the problems that we see in a lot of companies, they get overwhelmed by resumes and applications, right? So they don't look at everyone, let alone, and humans, sometimes when we're hungry, we judge people more harshly, or we're tired, right? We're in different moods. So none of that would happen to AI, right? Like the promise is like it's democratized hiring because they will give everyone the same fair chance. The company said like there will be no bias in these tools, and they're going to make hiring more efficient and less labor intensive. And that sounds great to everyone, right? Like I assume most recruiters don't like going through piles and piles of resumes. They would rather talk to candidates, interview them. So it sounds like a win-win-win for everyone.
Okay, now fast forward 5 years, you've written this book, and tell me, how are you feeling about it, and what did you think is underlying this premise.
I mean, maybe I can sort of recall one of the pivotal scenes when I went to one of the first conferences on AI in the workplace, and one of the companies, a one-way video vendor, was on stage and was sort of demoing the tool, and you sort of like saw how they do this like facial expression analysis, intonational voice analysis, and the words that people say, and I was just blown away. I saw like sort of this like digital mask over their faces, pulling out all of these emotional readings, and I was like, wow, this is like the future. And who knew that like facial emotion recognition, like what facial expressions you have in a job interview are predictive of how successful you be in the job. I mean, I was blown away. I was like, who knew? And then as I started to go down the research rabbit hole, I was like, oh, it turns out there is no science here. Like, we don't actually know what facial expressions we need in job interviews that will predict how successful we are in a job. And I was like, wait, if this is not based on anything, why are we doing this?
Right. And this is, I think this is a good example of it, because at first you can so easily be blinded by the science. As you say, when you see the overlaid map onto somebody's face and it's checking all their eyebrow movements, and you think, oh, wow, there's really something here. But
I mean, it looks objective, right? It looks mathematical. It looks like there's something being measured that, like, I, as a human, as a flawed soul of a human, would never come up with, didn't know that it was possible. We just assume that machines are just so much better than we are. And, and I was like, wow, it found something that we humans didn't even dare to think would be possible.
Right. And yet it turns out that those movements, they're really measuring something. That's a real measurement that the machine can do, but it has no predictive capability for what that person will do in the job.
Exactly. And it doesn't even have a predictive capability for what it says it does. So what it does is actually, computer vision is very good of measuring our facial expressions, meaning it can read that I'm smiling, but the problem is it will infer that I'm happy.
Right.
And as we all know, I'm sure we all have misconception about people's facial expressions, right? Like I've been in a lot of job interviews where I've smiled and a computer would have like absolutely read out that I'm smiling.
Yeah.
But I was zero happy, right? I was very nervous. I was very uncomfortable. And so it's not always true. The same thing if you have like, you're frowning, that doesn't mean always that you're angry, right? So that even the very promise of this technology, that it can read facial expressions that are connected to underlying emotions, is not true. And it really isn't true that it can measure our facial expressions and then can predict how successful we'll be in the workplace. That there's nothing there. It's just random correlation. It's just random stuff that it can measure, but it's not meaningful.
It's not meaningful. And you are very worried about this because you think that quite a lot of companies are basing high-stakes employment decisions on these tools.
Yes. And it's sort of like an under-researched space, because I think what happens is like it's a little bit hidden, right? Like a lot of job seekers upload their resumes on job platforms and on companies' applicant tracking systems, and then, it goes into this black hole. And that has been, that has happened pre-AI too, right? That you would upload you would apply to a job and you would send in your application material, and then you often didn't hear anything, or maybe you get an email. So it's like sort of a hidden process in a way. So we don't know a lot about it, right? And I sort of got a glimpse into it that we know that if you upload your resume, your cover letter to any of the large job platforms like Indeed, LinkedIn, ZipRecruiter, Monster, they all use some form of AI. And that's not necessarily bad. I think what's bad is that I found that there's a lot of bias and problematic things built into some of these tools. And that makes me worry, because I think, and it speaks to sort of like the overwhelm that recruiters and HR departments feel, right? They get like, so for example, Google said a few years ago they get about 3 million applications a year. IBM gets about 5 million applications. And just to give you a sense of the scope, like Goldman Sachs said a few years ago, for their summer internship program alone, they got over 225,000 applications. So it is overwhelming to humans, and recruiters and hiring managers need to bring it down to a manageable number of people they want to maybe call or send them to a next, assessment or something. So they will use like technology, right? But you don't want, like, technically you could also use a random number generator and just randomly select people. But obviously that isn't that is kind of no interest to companies, because you want the most qualified people. So these tools say like they find the most qualified people. But what I found is that that sometimes they don't because they use biased keywords. So for example, when I talk to employment lawyers who come in when maybe an AI company and a employer are talking, should we use this tool or not? Some of them do their due diligence and test these tools or bring in outside counsel. And I had a couple of employment lawyers that spoke to me. One said he found problems in every tool. One said about in every fourth tool. And they found things like keywords that the tool predicted upon makes you successful.
Yeah.
So in one instance, for example, if you had the word Thomas on your resume, you got more points.
Wow.
So as we all know, and, I have to apologize to the Thomases who listen to this, the word Thomas doesn't qualify you for anything.
Right. But this is
obviously
the reason
it's your experience.
It has this inbuilt bias is I forget the exact detail of it, but the readers will or listeners will send messages to me to tell me the truth of it. But it is something like there are more people running large companies I think it was in Britain rather than the US, but it'll apply everywhere, called Thomas or called one of those names like Charles, than there are women.
Yes.
And so it's one of those names that you can imagine the AI saying, well, this must predict the genius of these people. When,
exactly.
When actually what it does is it predicts something else.
Yeah, and that was like what I first thought when I first came across these kinds of problems. I think the first time I came across was that a tool had found out that the name Jared and playing lacrosse in high school is a predictor of success. So when I first talked to the first employment lawyer, I was like, oh, maybe the AI found something that we humans didn't know.
Yeah.
That like playing lacrosse in high school does, for whatever reason, makes you be better at this job. And they were laughing at me. They're like, you're thinking like a human. Like this is machines that do a statistical analysis. The machine doesn't find any magic. It just checks the pile of resumes of people who are currently in the job who are deemed as successful. And you're right on the money when you say like, oh, there's a lot of people who are C-suite leaders who are named Thomas. So in this case, maybe, you run like, I don't know, a tech division in a company. You take all the resumes of the people currently in the job, give it to the AI and say like, find out what these people have in common.
Right.
So it does what it does best. It does a statistical analysis. And statistically, there was a pattern of the word Thomas, right? In other ways, we found like, playing lacrosse in high school, basketball, baseball, right? All these like sort of random words that come up and then they become significant.
But some of those things,
they're not meaningful.
That's that's the problem is the AI doesn't understand what those words represent. So something like lacrosse and baseball, which is another example you give in your book, lacrosse in particular is associated with a certain socioeconomic group. You have to have a certain level of money in the school and space to be able to play it. And that is the reason why it is a better predictor. It's an example you sometimes hear, again, I'm using a gender example, but there are others, that a lot of the women who run very successful companies played a sport in high school. And on some level, that tells you, well, actually, because it gives you discipline, and it means that you're good at competition and you're good at playing at team sports. Actually, what it really tells you is that you went to a school where they had enough money in the system for you to play these games over and over to a high level by the time you were 16, 17, 18.
Yeah, and that's what we call bias proxies, right? Like we're not actually checking if you're going to be good at the job because we're looking at these other proxies, right? And some of them are very biased, right? It's sort of like the same thing that we, sort of maybe human bias is also pretty prevalent in some of these things, right? You look at people's resume, you look at the college they went to, and when you see Cambridge or Harvard, you think like, oh man, that person must be smart, right? Even though we know from social science that actually the school that you went to doesn't actually predict your IQ or how good you're going to be at the job. It actually predicts how well off your parents were. We see this again and again. So, and the question is like, well, if maybe lacrosse is predicted. Is it the teamwork? So then why aren't there other sports in there, right?
Yeah.
Right? Why is it lacrosse playing in high school?
Yeah.
And where does this end and where does this start? And we have like, as a society, I think, come to a consensus that like we want to look for folks based on merit, on their experience, on the way that they can do a job versus looking at like, are they a woman? Are they a man? Like what socioeconomic background they're coming from, what hobbies they have. None of that should actually matter in hiring, but through these machines, it comes back in, although it's still prevalent for humans as well. So it's a little bit tricky to report in this space because everyone always asks me like, how can we do better? And I'm like, Well, it is difficult. I'm not saying we should go back to the humans, right? Because humans are so biased. But I'm also saying if we automate this and we use AI tools, so let's build better tools that like don't pick up on like biased proxies.
But don't you think that actually the tools themselves might exacerbate the problem? You were giving the example earlier about IBM and Google. And when you have that number of candidates being interviewed, there's just no way for the human to interview that many people. Even if I was thinking of an example, even if you break it down to like 100 people. I mean, humans aren't good at processing even 100 individuals. So they're going to fall back on, as you were saying, their own bias proxies. They're going to say, well, this person worked at McKinsey, or this person went to an Ivy League school, or this person knows my cousin, most likely. That's usually the better proxy. And in reality, yes, having that number of people doesn't remove the bias, it solidifies it.
Yes. And so we have a couple of things, right? Like we have sort of like a bifurcated process where most of the rejection in the early stages of the hiring process is done by machines, right? Like, so we have AI resume screeners, we have one-way video interviews. That's often the next assessments that people get. So you just, there's no other person on the video. You just have like pre-recorded questions and then you record yourself answering, and that can be analyzed by machines or by humans. And then we have like games that people play, sort of like coding assessments, right? And then when the candidate pool is whittled down to like a manageable numbers, maybe 20 or 30 candidates or, what have you, then a human gets involved, right? And does like job interviews or maybe phone screens, and then a job interview is the next round. And we still see a lot of job interviews, like rounds after rounds, right? So that hasn't gone away. So we have this like double process. We have machines and then we have humans. And we have seen that machines bring in their own machine bias, right? They sort of replicate human bias because we have human flawed data coming into this, right? Where we use resumes of people who are currently in the job. Well, if you're not a perfect workplace, and probably none of us are because we all have unconscious bias, like you will have underrepresentation of people in the workplace. So if you use those resumes, right, that's exactly where you find Thomas's. Yeah. And so we have like flawed data coming into the system, and they guess, and it gets exacerbated by AI. But then AI also brings in, I don't know if it's its own bias, but it brings in these own problematic processes. So what we see is when you use any of the AI assessments, and I tested a bunch, and I looked at hundreds of them probably, you get these neat scores of people. It's like 79.32% match for the job. And you're like, wow, that's like so mathematic. And then the next person is like 82%, 0.3. And you're like, wow, okay. But is there really a difference between exactly the 80%, the 79%, right? And I think what we do with algorithms is like, we tell them you must rank people. So you must make a delineation between the two, even though maybe they have the same amount of experience and they're qualified the same way. We force the algorithm to make a ranking. And I think that's when sort of these other things come into play. And we see this in job platforms, for example. Like if you're a recruiter and you're looking for candidates, most of the time the algorithms aren't built to find the most qualified candidates. They're built to find the most qualified candidates likely to apply. Because you don't want people at the top of the search, like me, for example, who are very happy with their job. I'm really not going to really engage with the recruiter, right? So I'm not likely to apply. That is not something that you want to serve to a recruiter who pays for the product, right? They want people who will apply for the job, most likely. And so what the tool then does, it looks at behavior on the site. How many companies you follow? Do you like apply to senior positions? Do you follow companies? And it turns out that in this grand lake of like what we call behavioral data, men in general, not all men, but some, and fewer women, are sort of more aggressive. They write recruiters back more often, they follow more companies, they engage more on these platforms with others, and so they often get ranked higher, just a little bit higher. Right. When in reality, they're actually not more qualified. Right. So I think that's sort of the other thing. We force these algorithms to make a choice and to rank people, and so they start looking at things that that are not meaningful. And we've seen this in the past in these job platforms.
I like what you said about the idea that the AI has its own bias. This was something we discussed with Bruno Maçães. You probably know this author. He's written a book called World Builders. And he told me on the podcast that there are no neutral models. It's a mind, this is referring to AI, that has been created by other minds. And so you get the biases of those other minds. And you also get the biases that are deliberately introduced into the model for all kinds of political, economic, and social reasons. And this, I think, this is what you're talking about, that actually AI, as you apply it to hiring practices, it starts to end up developing its own bundle of biases, which sometimes you can't even really fully understand or parse.
Exactly. And it might not be like maybe as what we would think as human bias. It just makes these rankings, and it's not actually 100% clear what they're based on. And I think that's sort of a thing that we see, at least in the workplace in some of the AI. Most of the predictive AI that we see in the workplace is our deep neural networks. And you don't need to know what that is, but it means that we don't actually give the computer rules. We just give it a bunch of data and tell it, find out why these people are special compared to others, and then judge job seekers based on that. And I think that's where the problem comes in, that we then have a tool do statistical analysis on the people that you already have in the place, and that's how the bias and things pop up. And it acts kind of as a black box, I should add that. That's kind of important, right? That we then don't know how the ranking comes about because it is a black box, right? We don't actually know how they're being judged. We can interrogate the systems, but that isn't done very often because I think it's time consuming. And think about keywords on resumes. You might have a list of thousands of keywords that a tool used. Most companies are not kind of that interested.
They're not that interested,
if I may say that.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
They want to save money with these HR tools, right? Like HR is a cost center. You want to save money, and you don't want to hire now people to oversee these systems.
Yeah, and the system is really built for people like you were talking about, these massive companies that are processing so many. The majority of companies are small and medium sized. They're going to want to just have a tool which saves them a little bit of money and moves on.
Yeah, and they often use now we see small companies, like the job platforms try to cater to them, built in an ATS system for them. But you're right. The small companies are they might use some of it, but not all.
Yeah. Going back to the start, what we talked about with the Brian Christian book, what he calls the alignment problem. Do you think it's even possible to formalize some of these ideas like fairness and justice in a way that can actually be reflective of an AI system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the crux of the matter, right? That we are all struggling with. That, like, how do you translate social concepts that we as a society can't even agree on often, right? And you see this, like, obviously there is a huge political fight in the United States over it, right? Like, do we want diversity, equity, and inclusion or not? Yeah. And how would we actually sort of put that into, like, computer code that doesn't really work with variables? It's very difficult. And I think we see this again and again. I've also reported on gender bias and visual AI classifiers. And it's sort of like, how do these social concepts, how could we actually translate them? I mean, we can build different pathways to fairness into a computer program, but they're always like one kind of fairness. And they often don't hold up scrutiny to sort of human fairness. So for example, one thing that some technical folks and also some employment lawyers always say is, like, just use a random number generator. So you have 6,000 applicants, use a random number generator and pick out 100. That's actually fair in a weird way. Although as a human, as a one individual who put in their application, I don't think that doesn't feel fair to me at all. Right, in fact, I feel like, well, shouldn't you look at me? I'm like the most qualified or one of the most qualified. But technically, that is an idea of fairness. Not that these AI tools use that, but that we could use. But it feels like so wrong for a lot of humans. And what I'm trying to say is, like, our concept of fairness is so multifaceted that it is actually almost impossible to put it into computer code or even like assign that kind of meaning to computers.
Well, I think that's why it's so important to have this conversation right now, because, as you say, just in the United States, but it'll come elsewhere, there's a backlash against DEI hiring practices, against some of the hiring of women. And those are big conversations that are happening right now about values. For a long period of time, it seemed like those values were, if not immutable, at least a strong part of the society. And now, within a matter of weeks, they've been upended and they might go away.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's like really important to have that conversation. And I do want to also say that like if we get rid of like DEI, it's not like we have a merit-based system, right? I think that's the idea here, right? Like, oh, you stop looking at DEI as one of the tenets of hiring. If you get rid of that, then everyone has a fair playing field. That's actually not true. We don't have that merit-based system. We have this problem, especially with that we call confidence versus competence in a lot of job interviews. That, more men than women exude confidence, and we actually as humans think that equals competence. So if somebody is very confident in a job interview, often like hiring managers be like, well, they seem very confident, so they must be competent, but actually that's actually not true at all.
Those two don't correlate.
Those are two different things. And I think we all had that in the workplace, right? Where you feel like, oh, they were so confident about their abilities, then we hired them and they totally sucked.
They totally sucked. But nobody ever goes back and says, okay, let's think this through. We hired them based on their confidence. They totally sucked. Maybe using confidence is a bad way to do it. They never do that.
We do a horrible job at training humans, or not training humans, I should say, but most of the time, right? Like a lot of us, and I've hired people in the past. I'm totally untrained, and a lot of companies don't train people. What are you supposed to look for? How do you do like a rubric? How do you do like structured interviews? And I think if anything, any benefit came out of doing one-way video interviews is that they sort of implement an AI tool. Always ask the same questions in these one-way video interviews, right? And that is actually helpful to minimize bias. Like you shouldn't chit-chat with people in job interviews, because then you start thinking, oh, we went to the same school, we know the same people, right?
Yeah.
You see the person in a different light. The same thing if you start going off script, asking different questions, it becomes really hard to compare people. And you should have a rubric of like what is important in the job, but pointing to some of the flawed systems in hiring in general, right? Like it turns out that like job interviews are not that predictive, because you talk about the job. You're not actually doing the job. And it turns out a lot of people are very good at talking about the job, but maybe not so good at doing it, right? Like how can we build a more fair hiring system? And that would definitely exclude using deep neural networks, because those tools are sort of built to make their own decisions based on the training data, where we don't have a lot of oversight. So I wouldn't recommend using that.
Hilke Schellmann, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Hilke Schellmann in New York there. I mentioned at the top of the episode how this, it seems to me, is as much a social and political problem as it is a technology problem. But the political problem comes first. Now we're just dealing with the AI iteration of it. You see this in the US right now, how issues of fairness are back as part of the political debate. Certain issues which at one time seemed like they had just become an immutable fact of modern American life, such as DEI or free speech, are now very much up for consideration once again. These are not problems that were fought over and then painstakingly resolved by previous generations. They are, in fact, very much still being fought over. And so it's clear that these are political problems, social problems, that we as society still haven't worked out. No wonder then that we can't encode them into our artificial intelligence. But where I think it is different now is in oversight, in scale, and in accountability. These AI systems for employment will eventually be built at scale and licensed out to small and medium companies. If you think about the hiring tools that Hilke mentions, perhaps Microsoft will develop one in-house, but the majority of small and medium-sized companies, which are the majority of the economy, the places where most people work, those will use tools created elsewhere. So it'll be easy for any issues encoded in the AI to be pushed aside, as if they have nothing to do with that particular employer. And that's a question of accountability. And this is the point that Bruno Maçães made to me on the podcast that I referenced with Hilke, that the infrastructure gets created without oversight, and then it's hard or impossible to see inside the black box.
These models, which are going to become the infrastructure of our societies, will also have geopolitical views of this kind, very wide-ranging, broad, general, about how they organize the world, how they view the world. There will be a worldview incorporated into these models.
And you think that people won't really notice those worldviews?
No, of course not. Because, by the way, then these worldviews will not come out simply in direct questions where they might be revealed, but they will come up in all kinds of subtle ways. They will come up in the ways that factories are organized, because factories are going to be organized on the basis of these models. And so in rather unpredictable, subtle, profound, systemic, structural ways, these views are going to organize social economic processes in the future. I'm not talking about 2025, but I'm certainly talking about 2035.
And seeing inside that black box is important. Brian Christian, in his book The Alignment Problem, talks about proxy failures with AI, where the system optimizes for the proxy, but not for the goal. So an example from Hilke would be interviewing well or test scores as a proxy for intelligence or for the ability to do the job. An AI system may optimize for the proxy, for the test scores, but not for the underlying value. I do think that there is a strong case for AI and related technologies to help solve some of the major issues of our societies, including hiring and fair access to employment. In many respects, AI is an immensely exciting technology. But we need to be sure we're building them the right way. I actually think these two aspects of the technology are related, that if we build the tech the right way, more people will adopt it. We don't have to accept a bad AI system. In that way, it's like the adoption of the car. The more the safety and reliability of the technology has been proven, the faster has been the adoption of it. To the point where, cars are now a technology that are incredibly widespread. They're embedded into the fabric of our cities. And AI will be like that if we get it right. I think some of the guardrails that Hilke talks about are essential specifically to speed up the technology, not to slow it down. That's why we need to be having this conversation, to address the alignment problem and to consider solutions. And it's essential because the alternative is creating a two-tier system. Maçães talks about this, but so does Erik Baker when I invited him on. He talked about how a potentially unhealthy, unproductive obsession with entrepreneurialism in the United States has come about because technology is leaving workers behind.
On the one hand, if you're an industrial worker and you're dealing with the problem of overproduction or job displacing technological development, that can look like unemployment. It's all well and good to be told that you just need to put your head down and keep chugging along in your unpleasant work. But if you don't even have that work to do, that's not going to resonate in the same way. And so in that kind of context, the idea of creating work can instead be very appealing.
One way, I think, to blunt the alignment problem, or rather to solve it in a more human way, is to think about artificial intelligences, not merely one form of intelligence. These different systems are built by different teams, they're trained on different large language models, even teams with different work and national cultures will give different answers and will behave in different ways. And as we were talking about with the proxy issue, they might give better answers for the underlying values. But actually, strangely, that is a surprisingly utopian thought. It's not utopian because I think the values can't be encoded. It's actually utopian in a capitalist sense, where the idea that the best AI systems will inevitably rise to the top. I think, truthfully, that's foolish. There will be national barriers. And so the solutions to fixing the alignment problem are not easy to identify at this stage. In a way, it is easier to identify where the problem is than what the solution might be. Some of that is obvious. AI is a new technology, and as I discussed with Hilke, we barely understand the implications of the ways in which we're using it and the ways in which it currently works. In a way, we're building the technology at the same time as we're doing something that I think many of us never imagined we'd have to teach another intelligence. What exactly are human values? You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Hilke Schellmann's book, The Algorithm, is available to buy now. The episodes we referenced in this episode are linked in the show notes. This week's episode was produced by Finbar and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.